Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this discussion on Syria. I have three great experts with me today, Hasan Hasan, Ömer Özkızılcık, and Darin Khalifa. We will be discussing the regional context where Syria has made a lot of progress in terms of diplomatic outreach to regional countries as well as the big powers like the United States, Russia, and others. But we also want to focus on some of the internal dynamics. Without spending too much time on my opinions and my perspective, I want to turn to my speakers because I have three of them. I want to make the most of them, of their expertise. So, Hassan, President of Syria, al-Shara, I would say he has made a lot of successful diplomatic moves in the past months since last January. Most recently, he was at the UN. He met President Trump. Just last week, I believe he was in Moscow talking to Lavrov. He's been under pressure by Israel at some point, who conducted military actions. Lately, that seems to have died down a bit. So there's probably some backdoor diplomacy working there as well. When you look at, of course, there's Turkey's demands and requirements, security requirements from Syria as well. So al-Shara seems to be able to do a lot of things right, but then there's also a lot of pressures from the regional countries, as well as the large powers. Can you kind of explain that context, the regional context for us, and situate Syria in this sort of process of reconciliation internally, but also, outreach, diplomatic acceptance in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think many would agree. First of all, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys. Regionally, internationally, I think the new Syrian government has been the most successful outside. The old saying, what can go wrong will go wrong. What could have gone wrong didn't go wrong in Syria, and that's a big achievement. Syria has managed to do everything right when it comes to foreign policy, with the exception, obviously, of Israel, but that's the exception. Every country that can be useful to Syria is now an ally of Syria, and we cannot underestimate and downplay that factor. If, for example, another entity ruled Syria, they wouldn't be able to kind of gain friends in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, most Arab countries, and Russia and the US at the same time. That's a headline for me. It's the most interesting thing. The hope is that the government will be able to deliver on the expectations from outsiders as well, obviously from inside Syria. The best policy that people talk about is how you can do the right things internally in Syria, but in a way that also appeals to outsiders and vice versa. So everything's going well. At the same time, it's mostly diplomatic, kind of just keeping these countries away from them. We could have seen another scenario. All the support that has been pledged to Syria has not yet been felt inside the country, especially economic relief and economic development and so on and so forth. And the primary reason for that, when you talk to people from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and other countries, the first thing they say is the country cannot absorb all the aid. It cannot absorb all the kind of wave of investment because nothing is ready. The infrastructure is destroyed. I remember back in January, I met with the Saudi diplomat, and they said they expect electricity to be at least 8 hours a day in 6 months. That has not happened, almost 11 months into the whole thing. And that's primarily, they say it's not about support. We could give all the support we can just to put power right now in Syria, across Syria, but the infrastructure has been destroyed. So, that's the tension. Everyone is happy with Syria. Syria is happy with everyone outside. But at the same time, the pace of movement, pace of development is not moving, is not fast enough.
Thank you, Hassan. So you've made some recent trips there, and the challenges are enormous on the ground. We know this from a lot of reports and experts' visits. You mentioned the electricity. What are the other challenges, some of the challenges internally that you think are urgent that the regional countries could help or not help with?
So there's, the other economic issues. The country is destroyed. Every time we go there, spend 6 months away from it, you start to kind of feel disconnected from reality. You come back, it hits you again that the country is just not functional. It doesn't, it's not about, you can bring the best government in the world to run this country. It's not gonna, because you're running something that's completely dysfunctional and destroyed. The other issue, I think, people on social media elsewhere talk about the challenges with the Druze, the Swede challenge, the Alawite, and so on and so forth. But I think the only thing, one of those files that really resonates with people that you hear people talk about on the ground is the Kurdish issue.
Mm-hmm.
That because you have almost half of Syria geographically, close to half of Syria geographically, is under the control, is basically detached. Syria is disjointed in that sense. So economically, but also the locals, they've been waiting to be part of this, the new reality of Syria and, reach a peaceful solution of sort. And that is just dragging on, and people become, become so frustrated with it, even frustrated with the government, because the government with Turkey trying to find, with the US as well, trying to find a way out of this without a war until the end of the year. But the people on the ground are a bit more extreme, quote unquote. A lot of people are itching for a fight. Some people even prefer a war scenario because they don't want to have a situation where the SDF stays in control of that area. So it needs to be a drastic change of sort. And the hope, me as a Syrian, I hope that they will reach a peaceful solution, because even if you could destroy the SDF right now with a switch, that's not going to solve that's going to cause problems down the line. So the best way for Syrians and for outsiders, and this is where the US especially needs to really pull its weight behind this issue and make sure that there is a peaceful solution, because there's so many things that could go wrong and can unravel if this is not solved by the end of the year. And hopefully it's actually close to a peaceful solution.
Thank you, Hassan. Ömer, like Hassan mentioned, on the diplomatic front, things are going more or less well. There is support, there is even, financial support, but the infrastructure inside has serious problems, and then there's political problems, like Hassan talked about, the SDF and the Kurdish issue. Our event is titled Syria's Next Chapter, Integration and Reconstruction. Both of these challenges, integration is a political question. What sort of Syrian state are we going to be able to see in the next few years, and how, the SDF situation plays into that. And then there are reconstruction challenges because there's practically no infrastructure. Even if money could be available, things will take years to build. But if you could focus on that integration, political integration part, in the unity of the country, the territorial integrity of the country, what are the dynamics there that are pulling Syria this way or that?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for inviting me and providing this opportunity to speak about. So I argue that Syria's reconstruction is heavily linked with Syria's political integration. I mean, I also wrote a column about this, but to explain it, Syria's reconstruction requires a couple of hundred billion US dollars. And this requires the international community to provide funds and credits to Syria. But the issue is, Syria is not the only place that is now in need of support and development initiatives and revealing reconstruction efforts. We also have Ukraine, we also have Gaza now. And so the international community will not be as euphoric and as willing as to provide financial support to Syria as the Syrian government and the Syrian people wished. So we also need to see how can Syria at least partially fund its own reconstruction. Are there some resources? And the answer is yes, there are. I mean, there are oil fields in northeast of Syria. And we also know that Syria's electricity problem. Before the war, the two major electricity producing sites were the Tishin and Tapka dams. And all of these oil infrastructure and energy infrastructure sources are in areas controlled by the SDF. So up until a political integration happens, the Syrian people will be denied access to the oil fields. For instance, as of now, according to my estimates, the SDF, in addition to the smugglers involved in this and the PKK figures who smuggle the oil from Syria into Iraq as well, it makes around 1.3 billion US dollars per year. But if Syria's oil fields were being handled by professional companies, and it would be said according to international standards, Syria could gain a revenue of up to 15 billion US dollars per year. I mean, this is an important source of money that Syria could use for its own reconstruction. Yes, it requires some level of investments into the oil fields first, but the energy companies, they are more than willing, and many have already expressed their willingness to return to their oil fields. So, but this doesn't happen. And every day that passes is basically a day Syria loses in potential revenues and cannot use that for its reconstruction. And regarding integration, I mean, when it comes to political integration, I differentiate between the general public assessment. I think that in addition to what's happening in Suwaida and what's happening in coastal areas with the Alawites and with the SDF issue in northeastern Syria, there's also the issue of former Idlib. I mean, we should not underestimate the potential ramifications that could erupt if the people who are the backbone of Ahmed Shara and who were the main backbone of Hayat Tahrir Sham and his allies in Idlib feel alienated and left out. If they feel that the Syrian government is going towards a road that's not a road, a goal that they fought for. So I see that over the recent period of days and months, that there are people who are more and more frustrated with the way the Syrian government handles political integration and the political reforms in Syria. So, and this is basically a result of the discrepancy between international expectations and what Ahmed Shara's main support base wants. So we should understand that Ahmed Shara has brought Hayat Tahrir Sham quite far from where they initially began. There was a huge transformation process happening, but since December, it accelerated to such an extent that some cannot follow up. So while Ahmed Shah is doing these reforms and opening ups and these political engagements very fast for its own clientele and his own support base, from the perspective of the international community, Syria has to do more in a shorter period of time. So this discrepancy is a very difficult balancing act that the Syrian president has to go. And upon this difficult balancing act, as Hassan pointed out, we have the issue of northeastern Syria. Me personally, I believe that the Suwaida issue is relatively more localized, but the issue of northeastern Syria may have more impact on the political situation across Syria. And integrating the SDF into the Syrian state is a important goal that the Syrian government is trying to achieve, and it's also supported by the Americans and the Turks, so which is quite unique. But the issue is this March 10 agreement up until now couldn't be implemented. And even the biggest success that we had in terms of integration was in Aleppo city, where two neighborhoods were controlled by the SDF, namely Eshafia and Sheikh Maqsood, two neighborhoods in Aleppo city, totally disconnected from the rest of SDF held areas. They were officially already integrated into the state. Officially speaking, they became part of the international security forces. And this was like the poster boy or the model potentially for all of northeastern Syria. But we have seen recently that these all remained on paper, that this was just a rebranding, but not even a real rebranding. With the first security situation, the first clash, or with the first disagreement, we have seen actually on the ground, nothing changed. And the SDF has not integrated into the administrative system of Aleppo city. So this opens up the question, how will the whole of SDF in northeastern Syria be integrated? And here, we mostly speak about the Syrian Kurds, etc., but northeastern Syria is up to 80% Arab. So the Azor, where I visited, and Raqqa, and most parts of Hasaka Governorate, they are predominantly Arab areas. And the Kurdish population, as a rule of thumb, all of them live next to the Turkish border in the north of the M4 highway. And we see that the SDF and its decision-making cadres coming from the PKK cadres and the Syrian Kurds are having an overextended control, an overextended influence, and an overextended role in deciding the future of people they do not represent. And this is something that's quite difficult, because the people in northeastern Syria, they are, as Hassan pointed out, literally pushing Damascus to resolve this militarily and not to engage in a peaceful solution. But on the other side, we see that the SDF is not able to make any real concessions. So there were some good talks recently, but when we look ahead of the talks on what happened on the ground in reality, there isn't much that was achieved. I mean, even prisoners of war from the Syrian army that are being put in the prisons of the SDF, they have not been released. I mean, recently some were released, but there are still many remaining in the prisons. I mean, the SDF still hasn't handed over a list of its units, of its military arsenal to Damascus. And the question is, how should integration really happen? So there is a huge difference between what Damascus wants and the SDF wants. SDF basically wants legitimacy and rebranding, and Damascus wants full integration.
Quickly, what is the reason for this? Do you think is it, the US is not pushing them hard enough, or do they feel like they don't have to because Damascus is not strong enough to come after them, or Damascus is avoiding a civil conflict? What is the key thing that needs to change? You described how SDF won't in practice integrate, although on paper they've made several agreements. What is it, the key driver here?
I mean, I do believe that the SDF integration to the Syrian state, as well as the PKK's disarmament process with Türkiye, that they are interlinked with each other, and that we should not look at the SDF as a pure Syrian entity. It is predominantly still dominated by Kandil cadres, and the SDF Syrian Kurdish leadership are also people from the Kandil mountains. So why have they agreed to this initially? I mean, the main motivation was not an ideological motivation. It was more a realist assessment of the military balance of power on the ground. With the change of, with the topplement of the Assad regime, with Turkey in the north of SDF held areas, and Turkey with Damascus allied, the Americans willing to work with the Turks, SDF was cornered. But then, when Israel intervened in Syria and bombed Damascus, the Ministry of Defense, destroyed its main headquarters, and even targeted the Syrian presidential palace, its front, this was a clear signal to the SDF that Israel is willing to act and intervene. And this changed the balance of power. This is one of the major issues. So the SDF feels like that they can count on Israel to put enough pressure on Damascus if it comes to a military escalation. Secondly, when it comes to the PKK disarmament process, from a Turkish perspective, this is PKK dissolving itself and disarming itself. What we see in the Kurdish media and from SDF people, that they see this more as a political settlement. And many inside the SDF leadership believe that due to this process, the potential of Türkiye intervening militarily in northeastern Syria has been reduced significantly. So they don't feel the Turkish pressure as much as they did before signing the March 10 agreement. So this misperception, I don't think the reading or perception of the situation with Turkey is true, but this perception combined with the changing of balance of power by Israel is actually what is enabling SDF to not integrate, because in reality, they're not that much interested in integrating fully into the Syrian state. They need to be pushed.
Thank you, Ahmad. Dareen, thanks for your patience. You've heard all these comments. I actually would like you to maybe pick up on exactly where Omar left, because you've written about US sanctions, US's ability to basically have leverage over all parties that he just mentioned, SDF, Damascus, as well as Israel. What kind of a dynamic do you see there? And what are the things that, United States could do to help both the integration and the reconstruction process? Because, it holds important cards. It doesn't hold all the cards, obviously, but it holds important cards that could make critical differences in the dynamics that both Hassan and Omar described.
Well, thank you so much, Qatar, and thank you, Omar and Hassan, for your very insightful remarks. Let me pick up where Omar stopped and also try to answer your question, Qatar, about the US. So if I can summarize US priorities since December 8th up until now, I would say there are three things. One, continuing the counter-ISIS mission, so trying to shift a lot of the infrastructure and support that they've been giving to the Syrian Democratic Forces to channel that to Damascus to work with the central state. So in that process, they've been attempting to nudge Damascus to move to become part of the international coalition. The second is to try to mitigate further escalation between Syria and Israel. So they've been trying to deploy a lot of diplomacy and back channeling, but also facilitating direct meetings between Syria and Israel in order to find a security arrangement of some sort that would kind of put a halt on Israeli incursions into Syria, but also further Israeli airstrikes into the country. And the third is what Omar delved deeper into, which is the negotiations between Damascus and the SDF. And that very much feeds into the broader US strategy of kind of shifting the partnership of the counter-ISIS mission to Damascus. So the way the US thinks of this is that in order for the US to exit Syria, to depart from Syria, to withdraw troops, and to continue to be able to do CT operations in the country, there needs to be a peaceful resolution to the question of the Northeast, and that can only happen via negotiations. Now, there's been several rounds of talks. It's a very complex issue, and it requires time. I think the March 10 agreement was a great statement of intent. I think the only flaw in it is that it put a time cap that is incredibly unrealistic on such a big question, including folding civil and military and security institutions that have been in place in almost a quarter of Syria for over a decade into a very nascent structure that lies in Damascus within a few months. So it was very I would say, ambitious in terms of the time frame it put forward. But the one thing I would push back on that Omar had put forward in terms of why is the SDF holding back on their integration, I think we need to be honest and acknowledge that there's a lot of trust deficit in the country today, right? And it goes all around. So Damascus doesn't necessarily fully trust the SDF. The SDF obviously doesn't trust Damascus. And that you could apply that same logic to every group in Syria, whether it has arms or not. So they're still getting to know the government. And what really didn't help the case of the central government in Damascus is the wide-scale violations that happened in the coastal parts of the country, but also in Sweden, that resonated very much within the Kurdish communities in the Northeast. Now, that is making the SDF reluctant to move quickly in a process. So they prefer to have a more gradual approach with more guarantees. Damascus would like to move very quickly because of a number of reasons. Omar pointed to the economic drivers behind their desire to fold the Northeast, but it's also a political issue. And I think Hassan pointed to that. It's a massive issue among Syrians that Damascus today doesn't control Northeast Syria and doesn't control a large swath of territory in the country. So it's a legitimacy issue at heart, and it needs to be resolved quickly, because if al-Shara and the government today cannot fold the Northeast, it will be very difficult for them to fold their allies and partners and former factions that are supported by Turkey in a meaningful way, right? It's going to continue to be an obstacle in further integration of different parts of the country. And yeah, and we saw that in Sweden, but I mean, putting Sweden aside for now, just to say a few quick general remarks on the negotiation process between Damascus and the Northeast. I think at this point, it's safe to say that a continuation of the status quo is unfeasible. So the SDF having full hegemony over the security and military and civilian infrastructure in the Northeast is just not an acceptable formula for anyone. Right. I think the SDF understands that. I think Damascus knows that. And obviously, Turkey is very clear on that. I also agree that no party wants direct military confrontation at this point. I don't think any party thinks they're going to benefit from a direct military confrontation at this point. I would just qualify that by saying, I don't think the military option is off the table. I don't think the SDF thinks the military option is off the table, but I think all parties understand that prioritizing negotiations could benefit everyone. Right. So that's in of itself is positive. And I would say, I mean, the third part of all of this is that the gaps, while they're huge, they're bridgeable. And I've written extensively about the Northeast under Assad and the negotiations between the SDF and Assad. And I've always reached the same conclusion, having followed this so closely, that there wasn't a pathway for a mutually accepted formula between the SDF and Assad. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think Damascus is willing to give them a whole lot. So the president of Syria is talking about a decentralized form of governance in the Northeast. So he's shifted his own position on that. He initially started by there is no decentralization. So now he's moved farther on that. He very much made it clear that Kurdish rights are not even up for negotiations, that he's going to grant that without a political process of any sort. Damascus is now talking about doing amendments to the constitutional declaration in order to address some of the SDF concerns. So there's a lot that they're going to be willing to give to the SDF in the negotiation process in a way that I personally haven't seen in the last, I don't know, 10 years of the SDF talking to Damascus about some of these issues. So there is an opening there. And obviously the PKK-Turkey peace process is an opening in of itself, because it has eased pressure on the SDF and given them some time to actually find a negotiated settlement with Damascus. So I might be on the more optimistic side of things, but I also am very cognizant of the fact that folding in a very, very different military structure, the SDF is tens of thousands of fighters. The numbers are contested, obviously, and I'm not going to get into that, but it is a large military operation, right? That's been ongoing for a long time. They've been getting support from the international coalition. They've had their systems and processes in place, and folding that, as I mentioned earlier, into a very nascent military structure that is still even struggling to have internal coherence without the SDF is something that will take time and many rounds of negotiations. What I do worry about is the US diplomacy, while having been very effective in the last few months, and I really applaud the US Special Envoy for all the effort he's putting into this, it's looking for quick progress. And I think some of this stuff is going to require rounds and rounds of talks in order to find a settlement that would be acceptable to everyone. And we need to be open to that. So this is not something that's going to be resolved within the next weeks. It will take time. And I will stop here.
There one follow-up. So you're overall optimistic about if we let it be. I guess if we give them enough time, they can come to some sort of accommodation. But if the SDF is seeking some sort of decentralized form of government, and then Damascus is open to that, then it's difficult to talk about unity of the country to some extent, at least. How are those reconcilable, or how do you see that? Because if the goal is unity and they can come to an agreement, that's one thing. But if the goal is decentralized government and they can come to an agreement on that, those are very different things, it sounds like. But can you perhaps clarify or reconcile those two views?
Yeah, I don't think they're very different. I think there's a broad spectrum of options on the decentralization spectrum in which that is not short of federalism, right? And maybe I should have pointed that out earlier, that I don't think there is a federalist option that will be acceptable to at least 2 out of the 3 parties involved in these talks, right? So, and I also don't think we can musketeer federalism. We can't disguise federalism and call it something else and try to sell it to Damascus or to Turkey. So that's not an option that's on the table. However, short of federalism, there is a wide array of options that can be put on the table and can be negotiated that will basically end SDF security and military hegemony over the Northeast, will allow Syria's hydrocarbons to go to Damascus and be under the full control of Damascus, while maintaining a level of decentralized civil and military presence in at least Kurdish areas, if not beyond Kurdish areas for the SDF, at least in the interim, until a more concrete kind of aspects of the transition move forward. And I think, again, Damascus is talking about that openly. So they talk about decentralization options. The SDF is floating that. I don't think Turkey is going to object to that. So it is a time where creative ideas on a decentralized formula governance can really address some of these gaps, at least in the immediate term.
Thank you, Doreen. Hassan, let me ask you that last part, that Doreen did. I think you're on mute, by the way, Hassan. Doreen just described a situation where SDF could have not just civil, but also military, some power on the ground. And how do you see the feasibility of that scenario? And could they remain as some sort of armed military group in the medium and long term that they could, simply walk away, unless they give up arms?
So this issue, I completely agree with Doreen's analysis as well as Omar's. I don't see differences in there. So if in theory, at least in the way the Kurdish-led SDF presented itself for so many years, is that the SDF has Arab and Kurdish elements, and the Arabs are numerically more, even though the Kurdish factions or the Kurdish leadership controls everything. So in theory, you can actually integrate the whole thing, just like the Kurds are saying, but that everyone knows that's not the composition of the SDF. Meaning, if the people who are in the SDF today, Arab numerically, like there is barely any Kurdish footprint, right? Same thing in southern Hasaka, in Raqqa even. But is that the reality of the SDF? In reality, everyone knows that this is a Kurdish-led group, right? And that's the irony. I mean, the irony of the SDF is that for so long they presented themselves as a non-Kurdish, kind of a democratic entity, but they always negotiated as Kurds. And that's a contradiction they do. So now they're not negotiating. They are saying we want to maintain this, preserve this structure and integrate into the Syrian thing. But that's fine if it is what you say it is, right? And that's one flaw. I also agree that from the Kurdish perspective, there's a big problem now in Syria that it's not just centralized rule, it's hyper centralized, even hyper personal form of governance. And that doesn't apply just to the Kurds, it applies to the rest of the Syrians who have struggled and shared the struggle against the Assad regime, and they're outside the picture, right? So this is, but a lot of people say, okay, he's the guy who won. He needs to lead this interim period, and you know, we'll have time for kind of building the civil society and so on and so forth. So in terms of, and one other point I want to mention about the structures, one analogy you can think of to integrate the SDF that works for the Kurds, work maybe for Syria, as the rest of Syria, and for the Americans, is to maybe view it in the same lens like this, the Iraqi counterterrorism service. That was always part of the Iraqi army, but they had sort of special support by the US. So, sort of, they protected them from the likes of Maliki and other sectarian forces in Iraq. The problem there, that's not going to work for Syria, is that they had the Americans in Iraq. So they had that kind of in-house sort of protection inside Iraq that insulated that force and trained them and so on and so forth. In Syria, like Doreen said, the Americans want to leave. They want to keep some sort of some gains and make sure ISIS doesn't come back, either by through presence in Iraq or maybe some sort of de facto presence in Syria. But you know, they need to preserve that, and it's possible to envision that as the SDF, some of their forces maintain that brigade sort of a level unity, but they operate under command. Syrian, like from Damascus. The problem, like Darien said, is trust. Do you trust those, and are you building a fifth column from a Damascus perspective that eventually will build roots and become a problem that's hard to deal with in Syria? So it's a tricky, I think overall, I also share the optimism. I think Assad, when it came to Turkey, negotiation with Turkey and with the Kurds and with others, he always said no. Maximalist, he never agreed to anything. You have someone now in Damascus who is actually seeing benefit in getting the Kurds to work with him. Not, you know, just like he doesn't have an issue, let's say, with the Kurds. Turkey has lesser issue with the Kurds as Kurds, obviously now with the PKK problem on the way to being resolved. So I think there's way. I think the people pretending to be friends of the Kurds and advise them to be maximalist are the worst enemies of the Kurds. They need to be a bit more reasonable. It's a gamble for both sides to form a trust and kind of build on that trust down the line. It's going to be a gamble for both. But that's the only solution for the Kurds, for Syria, for Turkey, for everybody. That's the best solution.
Thank you, Hassan. Omar, you discussed in your writings the elections, upcoming elections. How would they help or not help the Syria's internal stability? You know, election times are always, polarizing times. People are going to campaign, etc. Should we expect something else? What is it supposed to achieve? The elections, because initially, when at the very beginning, when Shara made some comments about elections being down the road, showing a very long-term perspective, people criticized that and all that. But now there's actual talk of elections. In what form is it going to happen? What is it going to be able to reflect about Syria? What is it going to show? What is it going to achieve? Can you kind of talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this all correlates with the issue of time. I mean, when the time cap was set for end of this year in the March 10 agreement, Turkey was quite upset that the SDF was given so much time. So actually, Damascus was more willing to give the SDF time than Turkey was. And it was Damascus that basically convinced Ankara to wait out at least the end of the March 10 agreement. But that being said, time is not only of essence because of Turkey's desire and Turkey's urgency, but has the aspect that you mentioned, as well as the issue that the SDF is an organization that has roots that go for decades back. I mean, the PKK and its affiliates and its branches, they know how to play time. They know how to stall, they know how to survive, and how to play the time game. So putting time pressure is, from my perspective, quite important. And secondly, in terms of political system and the political future of Syria, look, we had indirect elections in Syria, albeit not perfect, but it was good at least. And we have seen that the parliament members, only a small minority are from HDS affiliated people. I mean, the majority are what we called in the past Syrian revolutionaries. And we see that now the election processes in areas controlled by the SDF were postponed. Okay, this was postponed. But then we have the issue that 1/3 of the Syrian parliament has to be appointed by al-Shara. So will 1/3 of the Syrian parliament members include people from SDF? Yes or no? I mean, if SDF does not integrate and we wait for SDF to integrate, then the Syrian parliament cannot begin its work. And the Syrian parliament doesn't have that much time. It needs to do quite a lot of things. It needs to come up with a political party law, with election law. It needs to organize local elections in Syria. Then the elections in the coming period that will elect the Syrian president and a new fully elected parliament by the people. It has to write a new constitution. And most experts, including me, think that the 5-year goal is very hard to keep. And now, due to the SDF, it's been postponed and postponed and postponed. But up until when? So the other alternative would be that Ahmed Shah appoints the 1/3 of the Syrian parliament, and the Syrian parliament begins without the parliament members from the areas controlled by the SDF and without any representation of the SDF. Then this would mean that the SDF as a political entity will not have any say or any role in the Syrian parliament, and this will create new problems in the future if we have a political solution. So all of these together is, for me, just there isn't that much time that Damascus can actually give the SDF, and the SDF needs to deliver. I mean, from March up until now, what concrete steps, what concrete positive developments have we seen? So far, nothing tangible. And this is quite concerning. And in regards to how the situation is, to make it more illustrative for our listeners, SDF have arrested people that have donated for reconstruction projects and reconstruction donation campaigns by the Syrian government. I mean, people who donate out of patriotism and auto support for their kin in Syria have been arrested by the SDF. We have seen people that express solidarity with the Syrian government being arrested by the SDF. The SDF has recently taken even a step against integration by preventing even Christian schools from teaching according to the curriculum by Damascus. The SDF is imposing its own curriculum, even on private Christian schools, because even though the curriculum of the SDF is not accepted anywhere, and the diplomas given to students doesn't have any meaning. So it doesn't accept the curriculum of Damascus anymore, which it did. And this is something very important for me. When we compare the current level of integration of the SDF with Damascus now and with the Assad regime in the past, actually it was relatively higher in the period of the Assad regime, because we had regime forces in SDF-held areas. There was an agreement in Hasaka, in Kamishli, and people would go to schools back and forth, and some schools were able to use the curriculum by Damascus. But now, with Assad gone, the level of integration did not increase, but decrease. So over time, we have seen a pathway on the ground that is opposed to what the SDF is speaking. And lastly, and I think this is very important to make, we need to differentiate between Kurdish-held areas, or Kurdish-dominated areas, and Arab-dominated areas. I mean, if the SDF wants a level of decentralization for Kurdish-dominated areas, I think that there's much more room for negotiations. But the SDF wants decentralization for Kurdish and Arab SDF-held areas, even for all of Syria, even though we know the majority of Syrians, according to everything that we have now, doesn't want decentralization, actually. So the second issue is we have to differentiate between the SDF per se and the YPG-dominated SDF and the YPG units. So the YPG units, the PKK affiliate units, if we exclude them, the rest of the SDF is quite relatively easy to integrate. And the level of trust is there much better than when it comes to the YPG. But the issue is, why is the YPG and people from the Kandil Mountains, Turkish citizen Kurds, Iranian citizen Kurds, Iraqi citizen Kurds, and Syrian citizen Kurds who didn't live in Syria up until last years and who spent most of the time in northern Iraq or in southeastern Türkiye, are in charge of areas like Deir ez-Zor, where it's predominantly Sunni Arab tribes, and the people they really hate the YPG and the SDF and want Damascus to control the areas. And lastly, and allow me to make this point, when it comes to integration, we have to be very cautious about what we mean with integration. If integration is meant as a form to have an army within the Syrian army, this is quite dangerous, because then the army within the army may become an ultimative tool for Syria's destabilization in the future. And it will be very easy for this army within the army to emancipate itself from the army and to do its own thing, and we will see a second round of civil war in Syria. So the best way forward, that I believe, is full integration, and the SDF should not use its position to get its own autonomy within the Syrian state, but to have Syria to be as democratic, as representative, as inclusive as possible. I mean, the Americans should not push ideas that are for pushing the idea of autonomy forward, but the idea of the political inclusivity, political representation, democracy, and freedom in Syria. Because this is the pathway towards solution in Syria. And having more and more freedoms in Syria is more important than giving some political and military powers to former people in the SDF.
Thank you, Omar. Darine, somewhat the same question to you. The recent elections, what are we supposed to make of them? How are they going to contribute to the dynamics we've been talking about? What does it, accomplish really? Was it in some ways premature without a deal with, SDF towards a common perspective, be it, decentralized form of government, etc.? Or, Omar was implying that, it actually there's time pressure on them because when are you going to hold elections, constitution writing, all sorts of processes that need to take place. So what is your perspective on the elections?
Right. So, Qatar, if you go and visit Damascus, with all its glory, it's very easy to miss that the country is in ruins. I completely agree with the point Hassan made about this, but like Deir ez-Zor city is in ruins. Aleppo, most of the country is in ruins. Half the population is displaced. So if you want to ask my personal opinion, I think if they had elections tomorrow or 3 years from now, I don't think that would have made a massive difference in the broader scheme of things. The country has much bigger issues now at play, right? I understand the need to consolidate. I understand the need to fill the legitimacy vacuum, as they put it. But at the end of the day, we're just ticking boxes. This is not a real democratic, it cannot be a real inclusive process at this point. And that's why in the constitutional declaration, it intentionally gave a lot of authority to the executive to try to address some of the imbalances that this process is inevitably going to create. So I don't see a way in which any elections in Syria, no matter who's part of it or not part of it, would be inclusive enough of women, minorities, that it would be democratic, that it would be open. I think we have to accept the fact that this transition, while having gone so much better than many of us had anticipated back in December, it will ultimately be flawed in terms of the political aspects of it and components of it. And a lot of people are going to feel left out. from it. There's going to be course corrections, there is going to be mistakes, and we have to be open to that fact. Elections are part of that, and I think the constitutional process is going to be, the drafting of the actual constitution is going to cause a lot of turmoil too, and a lot of political debate, but that's good. That's exactly what we didn't have less than 10 months ago, right? The fact that we're having this conversation, that Syrian civil society, that Kurds, that Alawis, that Druze are criticizing the process, that criticizing the president himself, this isn't a political opening that none of us had ever imagined would happen. So while I do think the technical aspects of it are going to be very messy, I think that in the bigger picture remains positive, because it is progressing. The overall trajectory is quite positive in that sense. And you have in the new authorities in Damascus, while incredibly centralized and, as Hassan put it, personalized, they're also very receptive to walking back missteps, right? So they're receptive to pushback, which again is something that the Assad regime lacked, like very much, in a way that was self-destructive, obviously. So we have seen them walk back a lot of the missteps they've taken in the process and prior to the process. So again, maybe I'm overly optimistic about it all, but because if you had asked me on December 9th, I would have not anticipated the amount of positive momentum, be it internationally or internally. And I think we have to credit a lot of diplomacy, but also willingness and ability to compromise. And that, I think, is what the source of my optimism on all of this. I might have not answered the question about elections, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to just give bigger picture take on it.
No, that's fine, Darine. I mean, months back, I got to see the destruction you're talking about, and the the way I thought about it in positive terms was that it was so destroyed, any improvement would be a plus. So the expectations would be very low. Like you said, except for Damascus, much of the country, except for small pockets, especially maybe along the border, Turkish border, some towns are actually kind of integrated into Turkey. But obviously you can't just make the entire country that way. But any kind of improvement, any kind of true investment, infrastructure improvement would be a plus. And then you could say, you could be optimistic in that sense, because expectations are so low. But at the beginning, I tried to raise that issue of uh, Israel's kind of security concerns and how US had to manage that. For now, it looks quiet. Can you maybe comment very briefly on Israel's role here? Like they showed that they could easily play the role of a disruptor. And they've done some of that, but do you see that repeating itself and sort of hampering any kind of progress in terms of building up legitimacy of the Damascus administration?
I do think Israel is the biggest, most external challenge to this transition, right? They have been from day one of this transition very quick to act in a military way, land grabs, aerial attacks, channeling support or funding support to insurgents and to groups acting against Damascus. So while the Israelis say they're not aiming for a regime collapse in Syria, I think they're pushing or at least they have pushed the country very, very close to a tipping point. And again, I commend US diplomacy for finding a way to get both parties to the negotiation table. But what the Israelis want at this point, or the way they operate in this post-October 7 mindset, is that they don't want to address current security concerns. They want to address potential security concerns, right? So they talk about the possibility of al-Shara becoming too strong and turning against him, but they also say that now he's too weak to rein in more hardline elements within his ranks or operating in Syria. So they feel the sense that they need to move in and do things themselves. And the whole discussion over the demilitarized zone in southern Syria is in essence not a demilitarized zone. It's in essence what they want is an Israeli controlled zone, right? And that's where it becomes more tricky. Damascus is willing to discuss a demilitarized zone in southern Syria in which international forces are present to kind of deconflict. So something that looks like the 1974 disengagement agreement between Syria and Israel, maybe with newly defined lines. But Israel says very clearly that the 1974 agreement is dead. They want to negotiate different borders and different parameters, and they're very reluctant to pull out of areas they've grabbed after December 8th. And I think that's going to be a problem. And while Shara so far has been so forward-leaning when it comes to very sensitive issues, like the fact that he is willing to put a pin in conversations around the Golan and sit around the negotiations table with the Israelis to discuss a security arrangement is incredible, right? The guy is from the Golan, right? That's where his family is from. But it is harder to get away with, it's harder for the Israelis to get away with maintaining all the areas they've captured after December 8th. And I think that's the sticking point in the negotiations. It seems that there's still momentum in the talks. So there might be a breakthrough perhaps in the next weeks or month. But it is one of the things that I don't think the authorities in Damascus are sitting there thinking that the threat has waned or is gone. They are very much aware and cognizant of the threat Israel poses on them. And they also understand that if Israel decides to massively escalate, that might go without consequences for them. So they understand that it's a low-cost thing for Israel, while it's an incredibly existential threat for Damascus.
Thank you. Back in January, February, many people, including myself, wrote about how, SDF and then Israel and then ethnic tensions internally were potential, problem points in ISIS, etc. Many of those predictions came to happen, and then I think we would all agree that Damascus was able to somehow navigate them rather successfully with a lot of, I guess, problems along the way. But so things that we thought that could happen did happen. So my next question is last question, and I'd like some brief answers if you can. Next, 6 months, a year, what is your immediate prediction of the main sort of driver of stability or instability in Syria? Hassan, I want to go one round, starting with you.
Israel,
What is the immediate thing for you?
exactly what Doreen said. I think Israel is the biggest threat, not by acting, sometimes by that perception that if anything goes wrong in Syria, there is a country in the region that's ready to step in and change the regime. That's a sense that actually drives people to have a policy of maybe stalling at least some factions within the Kurds. The maximalist position of the Druze sheikh, like religious clergy, also use that. It's something we've seen or we saw at the beginning of the Syrian conflict, when countries present themselves as about to step in and remove Bashar al-Assad. People escalate. So it's a factor we have. I know some people would object to that because they say this is a legitimate grievances. Yes, they are, but also exacerbated by a country outside that's willing to step in, waiting, locked and loaded to do something in Syria. The second thing is, to me, the economy. Obviously, that's so far, because of the events in Suwaida, I think a lot of the Shara base that at some point were not happy with certain things suddenly felt like the new system in danger. So we're going to have to rally behind it. And you have like that strong core. You cannot bet that this will continue. At some point, the biggest opportunity for Syria is when the SDF and Damascus agree to something. I think that will start to move things forward, in my opinion.
Thank you, Hassan. Omar, what's your take?
Sorry, I was muted. I mean, obviously, the biggest threat to Syria is Israel. I mean, the Israeli policy in Syria is still preferring a divided, fragmented, weak Syria over a unified and strong government in Syria. And this will continue to affect Syria's situation. And to me, this is also one of the major behind in the minds of the Syrian government, the reasons why Ahmed Shara was so eager to go to Moscow and meet with Vladimir Putin, just to see his options that he may eventually have or have to use or not. And Israel is the actor that everyone that's basically looking, as Hassan pointed out, to use something to weaken the Syrian government. And lastly, and I think here, after the ceasefire in Gaza, also many people in Damascus worry about, might this be a reason for Israel to now start a new escalatory spiral of events in Syria? I mean, may a ceasefire in Gaza actually push the Israeli government to be more aggressive in Syria? So far, we haven't seen the signs of that, but this is a fear that I have heard from people in Damascus. And the second biggest threat is the SDF issue. In the next 6 months, we will see a development either to the positive or to the negative, because there will be some sort of development. The time is running out. A Martian agreement has to be implemented by end of the year. And if it's been implemented partially, maybe it can be extended, or if there's a goodwill. If it's not implemented, if the status quo remains, will there be an extension of time? Will there be a new agreement, or will there be an escalation of violence? Because there is huge pressure from the people in Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa on the Syrian government to resolve this militarily. And especially the people from Deir ez-Zor, from Shuhayd, where Ahmed Shara began his operations in Syria, after returning from Iraq, they are from areas held currently by the SDF. And the Shuhaili people, they are very strongly against the SDF and the YPG, and they want a military solution. So there are people inside the Syrian government who don't want a political solution. And seeing that the time has run out, they may push for a military solution, which may limit Ahmed Shara's political room of maneuver to maybe give an extension of time, which I don't think he is much interested in giving anyway. However, lastly, I think we see more and more the risk of hardliners from Ahmed Shara's base potentially doing something negative, affecting the political stability of Syria. Because Ahmed Shara is moving too fast for these people. And Ahmed Shara's political reforms are just too much that they cannot fully comprehend and fully accept. So there is a growing resentment among the hardliners from Idlib. And so far, this resentment has been overlooked. And this is a threat that I see for Syria's future, near future.
Thank you. Darine, you have the last word.
All right, just very quickly, I agree with everything that Hassan and Omar had just said. Just to add to it, I worry about the short attention span of the international community. I think Syria being in the spotlight this last year has really kept the lights on, and the economic, political, and diplomatic support that the new government has been getting has been incredible and has also kept them in check. And I worry that that might wane, and when it does, I think it might be tougher for Syrians to push back and for things to move as smoothly as they have been. In terms of opportunity and to have the final word on a positive note, I think Ahmed Shara has an incredible opportunity to build a legacy in the region that is remarkable, but he can't do it alone. He needs Kurds, he needs Alawis, he needs Druze, but he also needs secular liberal Sunnis who disagree with him and who come from a very different ideological background. He needs Syrians to be on board with this. But again, this is an incredible opportunity. He can not just shape Syria, but he can shape the entire region in a very different, take it in a very different direction if he acts wisely or continues to act wisely. So.
Thank you, Darin Khalifa, Senior Advisor at International Crisis Group, Hassan, Editor-in-Chief of New Lines Magazine, and America Özkızılcık, Non-Resident Fellow with Atlantic Council. Great expertise, great discussion. I really appreciate your views, and thank you for bringing us all up to date with the developments, internal and external, in Syria. We all, I'm sure, hope for peace and stability in the short and medium term, and we'll continue these discussions in the weeks and months ahead. I appreciate your comments and thoughts. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
What's a
Thank
pleasure.
you.